Prima di voler raccontare la verità su suo fratello.
Here. There are several reasons why I waited so long. The first of which, I would say, becoming a mother. Becoming a mother really changed my perspective on my own childhood. And the responsibility of that, the responsibility of, and I write about in the book, my children and how they came into my life. And honesty is going to always play a very important role in their lives and their self-esteem. And in the United States, Into the Wild is required reading in about 3,000 high schools and colleges all across the country. And I go and speak at many universities and work with students of all ages. And when my youngest daughter, Christiana, she's a special needs child, and when she was able to start a full-day school program, I finally started accepting these invitations to speak at these schools. And much like it is here, sitting in front of a large audience, and they always had the same questions. They always wanted to know what drove Chris into the wild. Was it just his love of nature? They could tell from reading John's book that he was driven, and obviously he had some anger towards Walt and Billy. And they wanted to know why. And as time went on, I became more open to answering their questions fully. And when I did that, I saw the incredible impact it had on them. I understood all of those that are inspired by Chris. I started to realize what a disservice I had done, not only to Chris, but to all that read about him and all that want to understand him and relate to him. And I just knew that I had something very important to share. You know, the issues of domestic violence are also threaded through my book, and that's another thing, is I saw the power it had for young people to have someone that was willing to talk about that and relate to them. And I never left one school, not one time, where at least one student didn't reach out to me and finally ask for help. And I knew it was something, it got to the point where I couldn't not do it. You know, and Chris taught me that the greatest inspiration can only come from truth, so it was time for the whole truth to be told.
Esiste una sola verità in questa storia o anche in tutte le storie, oppure esistono tante verità soggettive? Qual è stato il tuo approccio appunto nello scrivere un libro, nel cercare quella che fosse la verità di Chris o la tua verità, di cercare di mediare tra quella che poteva essere la verità dei tuoi genitori, della tua famiglia o dei tuoi fratelli e sorelle? Come, appunto, qual è stato il tuo approccio a questa storia drammatica e di che cosa sei andata in cerca, appunto? Di quella che era la tua verità o quella di Chris, o esiste invece una verità obiettiva?
Yes, I understand. I think with all books that all powerful books, the reason they're powerful is because people relate to them in some way. You know, I learned in working with students that they don't learn from lectures. They don't learn from being spoken at. They learn by being, they learn when you talk to them, when you have a discussion with them, and you're not telling them how to think. You are figuring out how they think and what they need. And you said, you know, it was a dramatic and tragic story. It is very tragic, of course, that Chris died so young. But in my book, in telling my story, I'm filling in the blanks of Chris's story. And, you know, I'm using myself in that way because I want people to understand all that I learned from Chris, because I think that's the most honest and fairest way to help other people learn as much from him as they can. But it's definitely a dramatic story. It's tragic that he died so young, but I don't see, you know, the point of my book is not so much to focus on the sadness of Chris's death, but it's a sibling survival story. I'm the youngest of 8 children, and it takes a few chapters in this book to explain all of that, and the 2 families and how that all came about. But one of the most important lessons to come from that is that lesson of truth. And you know, our childhood, while it was full of issues of domestic violence, I think that, I know that for myself, the mental abuse, that dysfunction, the psychological manipulations, and the web of lies that were created to try to, by Walt and Billy, to hide their humanity. I mean, they made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The point of this book is to understand how that kind of dishonesty and that kind of psychological abuse and manipulation can, so much dysfunction, and how it tears a family apart, and the devastating effects that domestic violence has on children and families. But again, this is a survival story. There's 8 of us, 7 living, 6 of us have children, and we've all broken that cycle of violence. I think that's one of the things that Chris would be most proud of. And I want this book, my book, to give people hope. I want them to understand that no matter what happens to you in your life, I always try to explain to the students that you can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you choose to react to it. And everything in this life is energy. We are all energy, everything is energy. Everybody remembers, they know that class in school where you learn about that, and it's true. So you have to take these energies that come your way, and you have to turn them into a fuel. You have to use that energy to launch yourself into a new direction, and you can choose whether it is a positive direction or a negative direction. You know, in Chris's story, simply put, makes people think. It makes them think about how they're living their life, about priority. And I think, I know it's a long answer, I'm sorry, but in John's book, John does such a brilliant job of explaining Chris to the reader in a way that only John could understand, meaning I couldn't have explained Chris to you in that way because John is a young male. You know, he was a young male, an extreme adventurer, a taker of great risks. He understood that part of Chris, and that's what he shared with you, and he did it honestly, and he did it wonderfully. And the fact that he didn't put in the rest of the story is my fault. I was not ready for that to be told, and that goes back a little to your first question, why did I wait 20 years? And I was honestly waiting for 2 people to learn these important lessons that came from Chris's life and his death. And after realizing and speaking out at schools and opening myself up to social media finally after many, many years and receiving messages from people all over the world in so many languages, you know, I understood, maybe I've said this already, but the greatest inspiration can only come from truth, and that Chris deserved that, and that all those that want to know about him deserve that as well. And perhaps it would have been better for Walt and Billy if I had been more honest from the beginning and kind of forced that mirror. And we'll never know. Perhaps it would have taken away the opportunity for them to use John's book in a way to say it's not in here, so it didn't happen. But I think it's so important to focus on the positive parts of the whole story. That's what I do. That's what my family does. My sister Shauna is here, by the way. Shauna, you all will recognize from the book. And yeah, it's a sibling survival story. You know, it's about triumph over tragedy. Yeah.
Ecco, è vero che è una storia positiva e ecco, lungo tutto il libro. Carine, appunto, il libro pieno di fotografie, ci mostra le foto di Chris bambino e il suo sorriso. C'è sempre, Chris sorride sempre, è felice soprattutto quando sta in mezzo alla natura, quando riesce a compiere le sue piccole avventure da piccolo e poi sempre più importanti, sempre più grandi crescendo. Alla fine, ecco, l'insegnamento di Chris si riassume nella consapevolezza di sé, nell'avere consapevolezza di sé. Scrive Carine, pensai a quanto coraggio richieda fare tutto il necessario per scoprire la propria strada e seguirla, senza pensare a quanto ci porti lontano dalle nostre sicurezze. Adesso riuscivo a vedere con una chiarezza mai avuta prima quale fosse davvero la mia strada. Quindi l'esempio di Chris è servito comunque, è servito in qualche modo, anche se purtroppo è servito in una circostanza drammaticissima, però da quel dramma è riuscita Carine a tirar fuori un insegnamento sia per lei che per tutti i suoi fratelli, ma anche per le altre persone. E questo è forse il significato alla fine del libro, mostrare appunto quale può essere la strada che ciascuno di noi deve seguire.
Absolutely. One of the things I work with students on is understanding the difference between selfishness and self-awareness. Usually the students are kind of broken into two camps. Some think that Chris was brilliant, some think he was an idiot. Some people think Chris, they either admire him for his actions or they admonish him for his actions. And I'm not there to tell them how to think or to hinder their experience. I'm just there to help them process why they were assigned that book as required reading and help them to connect. And what I found was so effective was talking to them about that true path. I mean, Chris knew exactly what he needed to do. He didn't do it to hurt anyone. But Chris taught me, and students, everyone. I do corporate lectures too, so I'm working with people of all ages. But when you want to share something with someone, when you want to do some work in life that's productive and will make a difference, and you do that through speaking to people, they learn that from stories. They don't learn it from speeches. And the best way for me to explain all that I learned from Chris in this book, or to explain all the lessons that I think are important, is to explain the lessons that I learned. And the fact that his book, John's book, has been required reading for 20 years in the US just shows you how those lessons are timeless. And the fact that Into the Wild is in 60 countries, it's been translated into over 30 languages, that shows you that these lessons also go beyond cultures and demographics and borders of maps. I mean, it's and it does break down to those simple things about life. And are you truly living your life or simply existing? These are the kinds of things that people get from his story. And you mentioned that Chris, in the pictures, in nature, is happy. And one thing I wanted to add to that was, our household, was very tumultuous, and there was always sort of this, it wasn't always all bad. Walt and Billy didn't do everything wrong. Being born in the United States alone makes your life simpler than many. And we understood the advantages we had in life. We had a nice home. We had always had clean clothes. We always had, we went to the doctor and dentist when we needed to. We never worried about where our next meal was coming from. Walt and Billy taught us, to have a strong work ethic. But there were also some very basic things about your upbringing that were very confusing. The lies that I talked about earlier. When we would go to church, and it was such a hypocritical thing because, as I write in the book, we would sit in Sunday school and listen to our mother and father teach our friends that we play with on the playground at school or play with in the park in the neighborhood. And they would be teaching them about God. And then when we would go home and my father would have another rage, we were told that he was God. He would say, I am God, I can do no wrong. Nothing I do is wrong because I am God. And he was absolutely serious. And when you're a very little kid, that's very confusing to you. Going from church, you know, the Sunday school, and then sitting in the sanctuary and listening to the minister give the, the reverend give the sermon about God, and then you go home and you're told, no, I'm God. You know, it's very confusing. So, but amongst all of that, there was nature. Walt and Billy introduced us to nature. That was such a wonderful gift they gave us, because they would take us hiking quite often, and there are some beautiful mountains near where we lived in Virginia, the Appalachian Trail, the Shenandoah Mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains. And one thing that was so noticeable from such an early age that Chris and I, we talked about, but we didn't even have to talk about it. It was so tangible, was when we were outdoors and when we were hiking, the violence disappeared, the bickering, that tension and that fear of what's going to happen next, it just went away. Because my parents were focused on staying on trail and looking for the blaze marks on the trees and finding a clean water source and telling us which leaves we could use when we go to the bathroom so we weren't miserable 20 more minutes down the trail. Eating enough food, having energy, where to break camp for the night. That's where the focus went to. So from a very early age, there was sort of this refuge in nature. And I make a point in my book, I don't want to speak for Chris. I feel confident that I knew him better than anyone else, but I also think it's disrespectful to speak for him. I published excerpts of Chris's letters in the book after, not showing them to, really there's about 4 people in this world that have ever read them, and now you are among them for some of the excerpts. But I did that so Chris could speak for himself, because I think that's how it should be, and I think that that's how to best honor him. And I think it's better to not try to interpret. I do my best in here to make sure that I'm telling my opinion, and not telling people how Chris thought, but letting him do that himself. And I think that's the only way you can do it in a memoir, especially when your memoir involves someone else. You're attached to a very famous story, is to honestly share as much as you can what you're feeling and what you've learned. And then, the readers can interpret that and apply that to their own experience. But in the end, I believe Chris went into nature in search of what he lacked in his childhood, which was peace and purity and honesty, and where better to find that than in nature. And John writes about, and I actually take a segment from his book and I print it in mine, with his permission, of course. And it's when Chris takes one of the final pictures he takes of himself, and he's holding up that goodbye note that says, I've had a happy life and thank the Lord, goodbye, and God bless. It's very hard for me to look at, because just as John describes it, Chris, his face is so gaunt and thin and skeletal. His skin is just hanging on his bones. He knows he's dying. And Chris did not want to die. He loved life more than anyone I've ever known. And, but John never met him, but John looked at that picture and he wrote his own interpretation of that, and that was that Chris McCandless was at peace. He says there's no mistaking the look on his face. Chris McCandless was at peace, serene as a monk gone to God. And to me, I think he's exactly right. And in reading Chris's journals and in looking through his pictures, what brings me, I sort of have a good pain when I look at that picture. I'm not sure I can do it in front of a crowd without crying, so it's not one that I do, but I can talk about it. And what I see in that picture is someone who is at peace with the path they chose in life. And although it's tragic that he died at only 24, it's a victory how purely he lived his life and how he walked his path that he knew was right for him. And Chris had a very strong faith, and he knew it wasn't the end for him. You know, he knew there was more to that journey when he left his body behind. And it's in that way, it's a beautiful picture, because I always felt that we were sort of struggling to have our Father's unconditional love. I never felt that love was ever unconditional with them. It was always unconditional with both Walt and Billy. And I say that not to be cruel in any way. I'm just sharing the truth. And when you're out in nature, and when I look at that picture of Chris, and he's thanking God and saying he had a happy life, to me, he's finally found, you know, that Father's unconditional love. And that's it.
Questa lettera di cui parlavi, che Chris scrisse ai tuoi genitori, ai vostri genitori, e che appunto per la prima volta è presente in questo libro, in realtà tu l'avevi fatta leggere a John Krakauer, che però chiedendogli assolutamente di non parlarne, di non pubblicarla nel libro, e John ha accettato questo patto tra di voi. John scrive nell'introduzione al suo libro, e comunque anche nella bella prefazione a Into the Wild Truth, che si immedesimava molto in Chris, si sentiva molto simile a lui, condividevano lo stesso gusto per l'avventura, la stessa passione per la natura, eccetera. Com'è stato lavorare insieme a lui? Perché chiaramente lui si è rivolto alla tua famiglia per scrivere di Chris, ma con te ha stabilito un legame forse più forte che con gli altri, un legame speciale. Anche appunto il fatto che abbia mantenuto il segreto che tu gli avevi chiesto di mantenere per tutti questi anni fa capire come non fosse animato solamente dalla voglia di raccontare una storia, ma di quanto si fosse calato nelle vostre dinamiche familiari e abbia rispettato il vostro dolore e le vostre scelte, e le tue scelte in particolare. Quindi com'è stato appunto il rapporto con John Krakauer? Com'è stato lavorare con lui?
How many of you have read John's other books? Into Thin Air, yeah, Under the Banner of Heaven, Where Men and Glory. So something you know about John is he's an incredibly thorough journalist, and he will put every single detail in a book. First of all, I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I mean, I was 21. I still was dealing with the fact of Chris's death. I was absolutely certain that my parents would learn from this. How could they not? But I also didn't think anybody was going to buy John's book. I mean, we didn't think as a family. It was sort of a question as to why is he so interested in Chris's story, and why does he think that people are going to actually buy a whole book about that, you know? And little did I know, obviously. And I didn't realize, honestly, until all these years later, when I was writing Into the Wild Truth, and I was doing research, because I'm writing about some things that happened before I was born, and when you put the word truth in the title of a book, you have to make sure everything is very right and correct and honest. So it took me 3 years to write it, and John told me it took 3 years to write Into the Wild, so I felt like that was an okay number. But in that time, I had to do so many interviews with family, and everyone had their own comfort level. Some voices of the family, my siblings, come through the book very strong. Shauna, Shelley, other siblings were very present behind the scenes with helping me check facts and making sure I had things correct. But they wished I didn't felt I needed to write the book. You know, they gave me their trust and respect, but it's fair to say that it's not, they would be just as happy if I didn't feel I needed to do it. But in doing that, I realized what a terrible thing I had done to John Krakauer. And I called him, I said, I'm so sorry. Because for him to have the rest of this information and to not put it in the book, and John knew when my book came out that there would be some people that would be very critical of him because of that. But he encouraged me to write it, you know. He said, this is your story to tell, and it should come from you. And you know, as much credit to John, it was wonderful to work with John. He's a man of incredible integrity, amazing writer, so humble. I always say when people ask, what do you think Chris would be like today? I say, I think he'd be a lot like John Krakauer. And John always blushes. But like Chris, he's someone who doesn't really realize he's a remarkable person.